Hey guys, so here we are for our last lecture in our psychopathology class, and today we're going to be focusing on personality disorders. But before we get into the disorders, let's talk about personality for a minute. Personality, broadly speaking, can be thought of as a set of adjectives used to describe someone's behavior traits. And in this scenario, we're going to be talking more specifically about typical behaviors and traits. So not specifically how a person is in a particular scenario, but how they are across most times, most places. So examples include things like being outgoing, optimistic, condescending, or untrustworthy. An example that highlights the difference between usual tendencies and temporal ones is something like Juan, who's usually even-tempered and easygoing, becomes emotionally unstable whenever he is under stress. So the stable traits in that scenario are the even-temperedness, the fact that he's easygoing, and again, that's going to be the focus of diagnosis. So that's something that's important to consider when evaluating cases or just kind of evaluating these disorders in real life as you think about we're going to be talking a lot about media examples today. Is again, we're focusing on that stability, not how a person is under a particular amount of stress. The disorder, the personality disorder, broadly speaking, is defined by a series of culturally deviant traits that are causing distress or impairment. And much like what we discussed when reviewing the bipolar disorders, here as well, we're considering distress and impairment done to the individual as well as distress or impairment that could be done to others. One of the reasons this is important is because personality is just kind of how this person is. It's more atypical for personality to be problematic for the individual, particularly before it's been pointed out and clinically defined by a professional. And so up until that point, up until, first referral for therapy, that person's really main indicator of a problem may not so much be how their personality is impacting themselves, but the negative impact that it's having on those around them. Another hallmark of the disorder versus kind of a typical healthy, not problematic personality is the rigidity of the personality and the fact that it's not very flexible. So I know that I mentioned earlier the fact that we're dealing with stable traits here, but rigidity is kind of taking it to a whole nother level. So for example, it is considered healthy to be able to adjust one's tendencies given the situation. So for example, you might not be a very conscientious or hardworking individual in your day-to-day life, but it can be important and adaptive to adopt some of those traits in a workplace setting. And for someone whose personality is so rigid that they cannot make minor adjustments based on the environment, that's typically considered a hallmark of a disorder. And then finally, we're not going to be diagnosing any disorders until a person is at least 18 years of age. This is because there are a number of tendencies that are pretty common to see amongst teenagers that fall particularly, I would say, more within the cluster B kind of category that we'll talk about later. And so we just want to make sure that before moving ahead with a big personality disorder diagnosis, that we're sure this is kind of how this person is consistently, and it's not something that they're simply going to age out of. For the most part, personality is very stable, but there are certain traits that we'll see more from certain age groups, again, particularly young people, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So the DSM, the DSM-4, the DSM-5, there weren't really any changes in this area, but it divides our personality disorders into 3 clusters based on theme, and there are 10 disorders total. Cluster A is the odd or eccentric cluster and includes paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. An interesting thing about this cluster is that All of these have similarities to schizophrenia, which is one of the reasons I like reviewing this chapter after the schizophrenia chapter, and that all of these may ultimately be precursors to schizophrenia. That's not to say that everyone with a cluster A diagnosis develops schizophrenia, but for some, their cluster A diagnosis ends up being a part of that pre-morbid level of functioning towards a later development of schizophrenia. Cluster B is the dramatic, emotional, or erratic cluster, which includes borderline, histrionic, narcissistic, and antisocial personality disorders. And then cluster C is the anxious or fearful cluster, including avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorders. So for each of these disorders, I'm going to include a media example just because I've gotten good feedback from students in the past that that's been a helpful way to learn such a large amount of new material. Since we're really going over 10 today, we haven't really done 10 in a chapter before. And what's more is that I really have found through the years that once you have a solid understanding of the personality disorders, that you really do see them in media quite often. They apparently make for compelling characters that writers, whether they're aware of it or not, have a tendency to write these types of characters. So they are legitimately personalities that crop up quite often. So it's not like I'm really digging a ton to kind of find these. But anyways, I am kind of presenting media examples, which is something I don't typically do. Typically, I tend to err towards real life cases. But again, I think this is just kind of a nice way to learn these disorders and a nice kind of change of pace as well. So with each slide, I'll be reviewing the disorder, the symptoms, rule outs, and we'll also be talking about a media example. So first, we have paranoid personality disorder. At its core, this one is a pervasive distrust and suspiciousness of others, combined with a tendency to interpret motives as malevolent. So that's kind of the first piece I would direct your attention to on each of these slides, is that opening statement or sentence. This is what I like to call kind of the core feature or the essence of each personality disorder. And of course, there are going to be subsequent symptoms that we're going to go over, but to separate out these disorders, particularly within cluster where there are more similarities, that kind of opening sentence is again kind of the essence, the core defining feature of the disorder. So that can be helpful to familiarize yourself with first before introducing the rest of the symptoms. This one begins in early adulthood, as really they all do. We're looking for, again, someone to be 18 before we diagnose. And here we're looking for 4 more additional symptoms, which include suspecting without basis that others are exploiting, harming, or deceiving the individual, being preoccupied with unjustified doubts about whether or not others are trustworthy, being reluctant to confide in others out of fear that information will be used against them, reading hidden or threatening meanings into benign circumstances, persistently bearing grudges, perceiving attacks on their character not apparent to others, and being quick to react angrily, and having recurrent suspicions regarding the fidelity of a spouse or sexual partner if that person is in some type of relationship. So the key, again, across all of these symptoms is suspiciousness of others, really without any evidence or reason to be suspicious of others. That's really kind of what makes this a disorder. Is it'd be one thing if there were reason to really be suspicious and on edge, but there's really not. And several of these symptoms really hit on that. The fact that there is no information, these doubts are unjustified, and yet this person is highly suspicious and distrusting of others. We want to rule out other causes, namely schizophrenia and mood disorders with psychotic features. A great example of this one in the media is Nina from the movie Black Swan that came out, a while ago at this point. She's played by Natalie Portman. In a nutshell, the movie is about a group of ballerinas who are in the ballet Swan Lake. She is ultimately cast in the lead in that ballet and believes fellow ballerina is out to steal her role. She gets angry. She bears grudges towards her understudy, towards the director, towards her mom. She's untrusting of others despite there being a lack of evidence. So she eventually gets to the point in the movie where she's hallucinating, which is why I say this is an interesting example that really borders on schizophrenia. So she's a good example, not just of the paranoid personality disorder, but of someone who I would say is on track to developing schizophrenia. So this particular example would be a good example of one in which that personality disorder is more of that pre-morbid, prodromal kind of phase that eventually ends up developing those more acute psychotic symptoms. Schizoid personality disorder is very different. This is a pervasive detachment from social relationships and a restricted range of emotion. So there's a real flatness here across both socialization and emotional expression. Again, begins at the same point in time, and we're looking for 4 more symptoms, which includes not really desiring or enjoying close relationships, and this may even include with other family members. Pretty exclusively choosing solitary activities, having little or no interest in sexual experiences with another person. So take note here that that would be kind of an asexual sexual identity, but we may be seeing that symptom associated with a variety of other symptoms. So we're not pathologizing an asexual personality here, but that may be a part of this person's presentation. They may be pretty anhedonic, but without the normal enjoyment for activities that's being taken away from depression, but just kind of across the board, their nature, the way they typically are at baseline is to enjoy few activities. They may lack close friends. They may be indifferent to feedback from others, namely because they're not really interested in bonding with others. And so when you think about it, if you weren't really interested in bonding, you wouldn't really react to the praise or criticism of someone else. And then finally, they may be described as cold, detached, or flat. We want to rule out other causes, which again includes schizophrenia, psychotic mood disorders, and also autism, just because of the flatness with respect to emotion and socialization. A really good example of this one's Plankton from SpongeBob. He's got a very flat personality, flat tone. Doesn't really have any close relationships with anyone except for his wife, who is a robot. We can assume from that scenario, potentially even without the fact that this is a children's show, that there's no interest in sexual experience. He really only has one interest, which is plotting destruction. As I said before, very flat with limited emotional expression as well. So he's a good example of the schizoid type. And then finally, we have schizotypal personality disorder, which is a pervasive deficit in social skills that contributes to few close relationships. We also have just really eccentric, quirky behaviors and cognitive perceptual distortions as well. So the first thing to point out here is that while this individual also has fewer close relationships, a lot of that really comes from a deficit in social skills. This individual is wanting those relationships though. And I like to always point that out because that can be a confusing distinction between this one and the schizoid type. And here we're looking for 5 or more symptoms. Much of the reason for the increase in symptom count here is because some of these symptoms could be considered relatively normal by themselves. So we really want to make sure that we have a good collection of symptoms, a good combination of symptoms, combined with that distress or impairment in order to diagnose. And I've bolded the ones that are really very kind of hallmarked to this type. But again, anything from this list obviously would count. Up first, we have ideas of reference. Ideas of reference are kind of like the odd beliefs or the magical thinking that you see in the next symptom group. Basically, what it's referring to is the tendency to believe that things are maybe connected in an omniscient kind of way, that there's not really any evidence to believe that things are connected in that particular way. The example I always give of this is from the TV show How I Met Your Mother. If you ever watched that show, throughout all of the seasons, there's constant reference to the universe, quote unquote, Like, if it rains and this girl can't go on her office retreat, then that's a sign that I'm supposed to be with her. Or if I find a doppelganger of my friend, then that is the universe telling me it's time to start planning a family. These are some examples from the show. So there's constant reference to the universe, and if things kind of click into place, then that's a sign, quote unquote. So that would be considered an idea of reference. And again, we're not automatically diagnosing people that believe in ideas of reference or have other forms of magical thinking. But again, if we're seeing 5 or more of these collectively, that's really starting to cause problems for the person, like they're not forming close relationships as a consequence of these symptoms, that's really the point when we would diagnose. The second symptom is closely related: odd beliefs or magical thinking inconsistent with social norms. So beliefs or magical thinking that aren't considered quote unquote normal. And you can reference back to chapter 1 for what we kind of think of as being normal societally. So an example might be something like believing in clairvoyance. We may see unusual perceptual experiences, including bodily illusions. These could border potentially on hallucinations, but we want to be really clear in kind of differentiating those out. We may see odd thinking in speech. So a person may talk in a very kind of metaphorical, stereotyped, vague, alliterative type of way. We may see suspiciousness or paranoid ideation, inappropriate or restricted affect. We may also see odd, eccentric, or peculiar behaviors or appearance. We may see odd, eccentric, we may see a lack of close friends. And then finally, we may also see social anxiety develop that's associated with paranoia that doesn't diminish with familiarity. Meaning that the person doesn't desensitize and the social anxiety doesn't lessen as the person becomes more familiar with the circumstances. We want to rule out same causes as before. And again, you can kind of see how we might see some overlap here with autism in the behaviors, the thinking style, the lack of close friends, the eccentricity. Those are things that could overlap with autism. And you guys will get a better feel for what autism is when you complete the DSM practice activity at the end of the semester. A good example of this one is Willy Wonka. I would really say any portrayal of this character, the character itself is very schizotypal. He talks in a very odd way, so he's a good example of that very musical kind of speech and how speech can just kind of be odd in nature. There is a magical kind of make-believe quality to his world and the way he thinks. He's totally fine with kids turning into candy in his factory. He dresses in a very odd, eccentric way. And his social life is pretty limited. It really just consists of the Oompa Loompas. So he's a good example of this personality type. So to review, paranoid personality is pervasive, unjustified distrust without or despite evidence to the contrary, may even borderline on delusional. Schizoid is going to be social and experiential, emotional indifference. There are no hallucinations, delusions, or derealization in these cases. However, brief psychotic episodes may be diagnosed in times of stress. And then finally, schizotypal is a collection of kind of quirks and idiosyncrasies that negatively impact the person's social relationships. Unusual thoughts and beliefs are generally more incorrect, I would say, than delusional. And all 3 diagnoses may be specified as pre-morbid if they end up presenting before what ultimately becomes schizophrenia. All right, so moving ahead to cluster B. Up first, we have antisocial personality disorder. This is a pervasive disregard for and violation of the rights of others, occurring since age 15 and indicated by 3 or more symptoms. So a couple of differences already we can see. We're dealing with a new age piece. And fewer symptoms. If you look ahead, you'll see that we still aren't diagnosing this ultimately until a person is 18 years old. But whether you're working with a 15-year-old actively or you're looking back over a case historically, you want to see indicators that the person is kind of on this path since about 15, although we ultimately aren't eventually giving this particular diagnosis until the person is 18 years of age. We're also looking at fewer symptoms in this scenario because, as you can see, these are very serious symptoms. So we really only need a few of them to diagnose. So we've got failure to abide by the law, demonstrated by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest, even if the person hasn't ultimately been arrested. Deceit, which could include lying, conning, or having numerous aliases. Impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. Irritability or aggressiveness. A reckless disregard for the safety of others. Irresponsibility could be with respect to work, financial irresponsibility, and a lack of remorse after hurting or mistreating another. And I would say that this last symptom is really kind of the hallmark here, or a real indicator that we're dealing with antisocial, is that lack of empathy, that lack of remorse. Again, we're not diagnosing until the person is 18, but there has to be evidence of a conduct disorder at a younger age. A conduct disorder, you'll find it in the neurodevelopmental chapter of your textbook if you are working from the text this semester. And it's basically kind of a juvenile adolescent version of this that includes things like cruelty to people and animals, regularly breaking the law, destruction of property, a lot of really behaviorally deviant types of symptoms. So again, even if you're working with someone who's older and you didn't work with the person when they were 15, looking back historically, there should be evidence that this disorder was present before 15, even if it was never diagnosed. We want to rule out other causes, including schizophrenia and bipolar disorders. And I also always like to point out that these criteria can be fulfilled violently or non-violently. And that's actually where the terms psychopath and sociopath come from. These are terms you probably are more familiar with than antisocial. And typically these, first of all, these are more legal phrases. And that these terms are used when we're dealing with an antisocial type of personality who's also violent. Because it is possible to fulfill these criteria in a non-violent way. Through something like a Ponzi scheme that is manipulative, financially irresponsible, might include the person not really being remorseful for what they've done. And so it's possible to be nonviolent, which is something I always like to point out to students, that this one isn't something that is exclusively violent. I don't have a media example for this one. That being said, though, I mean, you can see it across a huge variety of true crime types of media. The movie American Psycho is a good example of this one as well. There are really tons of examples of this one, which is why I ultimately didn't kind of give you a specific example. Borderline personality is up next. Instability is really the name of the game with this one. Instability across interpersonal relationships, self-image, and emotions as well. Occurring across contexts. Again, we're not going to diagnose until 18, and we're looking at 5 or more symptoms. Again, the reason we're looking at a higher symptom count here is because, you may see some of these kind of on their own. And so we want to make sure that we have a solid kind of assortment of symptoms here before diagnosing. So symptoms include a frantic effort to avoid real or imagined abandonment. So there could be real abandonment, could not be, but the person's very focused on the idea of not being left alone, not being rejected, not being abandoned. Unstable or intense interpersonal relationships, alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. So really loving a person platonically, romantically, and then fairly quickly being able to hate the person or have ill will towards them. We could similarly see an identity disturbance where the person feels similarly about themselves. Damaging impulsivity in at least 2 areas, which include sex, reckless driving or spending, binge eating as just examples. Recurrent suicidal or self-mutilating behavior. Emotional instability, which is going to include intense episodic moods lasting a few hours to a few days. So this is one where mood can change really quickly, especially compared to something like a bipolar disorder, which you guys know at this point is going to be diagnosed more in the presence of what's actually pretty stable mood being consistent for several days to weeks at a time. Here we're dealing with mood changes that could last hours to a few days. We may see chronic feelings of emptiness, inappropriate or intense anger, and temporary stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. My favorite example of this is from the movie The Last King of Scotland, which is a movie about a Ugandan dictator named Idi Amin. It's based on a true story, a real guy. You really need to watch the whole movie. I've tried to find clips that will narrow in on good kind of borderline examples, but you really need to watch the whole movie to get the full kind of feel for borderline. He goes through just very fast emotional changes. He ultimately forms a friendship in the movie with a Scottish doctor, who this guy's a physician doing kind of mission work in Uganda, and somehow ends up getting roped into being this guy's personal physician. But even within that role, Edie eventually kind of pulls him in closer to really his inner circle as far as making political and advisory types of decisions, which kind of highlights that intensity in terms of interpersonal relationships. And then when something goes badly, he is very quick to change his tone. And again, you really just need to kind of watch the whole thing to get a feel for that instability and that quickness and readiness to kind of change demeanor throughout the whole film. Cluster B, we've got narcissistic personality disorder. This is someone with a pervasive grandiosity, need for admiration, lack of empathy, that is occurring across contexts and is indicated by 5 or more symptoms. So this person feels really good about themselves, lack of empathy from others. Some of these are symptoms you'll recognize from our discussion of manic and hypomanic episodes, like the grandiose self-importance, although this is very distinct from mania and hypomania, but you will see some symptom overlap. So symptoms include a grandiose sense of self-importance, for example, a tendency to exaggerate achievements or expect recognition from others as being superior, being preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited power, brilliance, beauty, etc., believing he or she is special and should only associate with like-minded individuals, requiring excessive admiration, a sense of entitlement, interpersonally exploitative, taking advantage of others, lacking in empathy, often being envious of others or believing others are envious of them, arrogant, haughty types of behaviors or attitude as well. So that grandiosity, again, is something you should be familiar with, but newer features here that really distinguish it from the mood disorders would be that need for admiration and really that lack of empathy, that willingness to walk over other people for personal achievement, for personal admiration. Variety of examples I could give you of this one. One that I go to a lot is Walter White from Breaking Bad. He is a good example of someone who is legitimately good at what he does. For those of you unfamiliar with the general story, it's about a high school chemistry teacher who is diagnosed with cancer and begins cooking and selling meth as a way to pay for his hospital bills before he dies. He ends up not dying because of cancer, but I won't get into the plot of the show too much. But in a nutshell, he's actually really good at what he does, but he is still very full of himself, believes he's the best, he's better than his partner, he's better than other makers, he's better than the police. So there still is a grandiosity there, despite the fact that there is some skill to kind of back that up, and there is some real intelligence there. There is definitely a belief in being special, a need for admiration. There's interpersonal exploitation. He eventually takes major advantage of his family and his friends, and a pretty severe lack of empathy as the show progresses as well. As far as histrionic personality disorder goes, this is pervasive, excessive emotionality and attention-seeking behaviors. Again, we're looking for 5 symptoms across contexts. So this one really is kind of this emotional shallowness and desire for attention more so than admiration, specifically from other people. So this one includes being uncomfortable in situations in which they are not the center of attention, interactions with others that are characterized by inappropriately sexually seductive behaviors, rapidly shifting and shallow emotions, consistent use of physical appearance to draw attention, in very shallow impressionistic speech, a theatricality, a tendency for drama and exaggerated emotion, a gullibility, very highly suggestible, easily influenced by others, and a tendency to consider relationships more intimate than they are. My favorite example of this one is Zoolander, specifically Derek Zoolander, the main character in the movie. Or I guess movies at this point. He is a male model who is very dramatic and theatrical. The first movie opens with him accepting an award that he didn't win because he's so in his own head that he doesn't even really hear the fact that he didn't win this particular award. He is a very shallow personality, very dramatic, very surface level speech, by nature of the fact that, you know, he's a model and what he does is very focused on the physical form. He is very likely to use kind of physical appearance as a way to draw attention, or sexually seductive behaviors. He's highly gullible as well. The plot of the first movie entails him being hypnotized into killing a prime minister. So just a really good example of this histrionic personality type. And a good TV show that is just a nice assortment of all of Cluster B is It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, if you've ever seen that one. I won't go into details, but if you've ever seen it, you know that there are numerous characters with various combinations of all of these traits. So to sum up, antisocial personality is really a disregard for others without empathy, combined with a tendency to do harm, break the law. This is colloquially referred to as someone who's a psychopath or a sociopath, but as you guys know at this point, those are actually legal terms, and they refer to a combination of this diagnosis with a tendency for violence. Borderline personality is just instability across relationships, self-image, and mood. Colloquially, this one can be referred to as bipolar, and frequently when people use the term bipolar to refer to like the weather or something that's changing really quickly, what they're actually really getting at more is borderline. And again, if you guys think back or refer back to the bipolar disorders, you'll recall that you need 4 days a week, 2 weeks of mood, versus here we're dealing with hours in some cases. So this is really the fast moving diagnosis. Borderline as a phrase originated as a term to refer to the border between neurosis, and psychosis, meaning that this person may tip into psychotic territory occasionally. And of all the personality disorders, this is the only one with an empirically supported treatment, specifically dialectical behavior therapy that we'll talk about towards the end. And then finally, narcissistic and histrionic personality disorders are very similar in their need for attention or admiration. However, they can be differentiated on the basis that narcissism really has that grandiosity and aggression, versus histrionic may be associated with more kind of drama and shallow emotionality instead. Some critics will argue that the disorders are really the same, but kind of hyper masculine and hyper feminine versions of one another. And there is, real reason to make that criticism, but at the end of the day, they are still considered to be two distinct diagnoses. Finally, cluster C, or anxious avoidant cluster. And up first, we have notably avoidant personality disorder. With this one, we're dealing with pervasive social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, hypersensitivity to negative evaluation. And again, we're looking at 4 more symptoms here. This individual is going to be avoiding work-related activities that involve interpersonal contact, so they may even prefer jobs that are solo or kind of night shift in nature. Unwilling to get involved with other people out of a fear of rejection, restraint within relationships because of fear of ridicule, preoccupation with criticism or rejection in social situations, inhibition in new interpersonal situations, viewing oneself as socially inept, and finally, reluctance to take personal risks or engage in new activities. There aren't a ton of good media examples of this one just because of the avoidant nature. This is someone who wouldn't really be commanding the screen. But across the board, you can definitely see the theme here is social inhibition, sensitivity to feedback from others, just avoidance in general. And in fact, this one overlaps really, really strongly with the social anxiety disorder that we talked about a while ago at this point. One of the big differences between those two diagnoses is that last symptom, the reluctance to take personal risks or engage in new activities. That's really unique to the avoidant personality. That's not something that you're going to see from someone with social anxiety. Other differences between those two diagnoses include that this one is more chronic because it's based in personality, which is pretty consistent and stable, versus someone with a social anxiety. That anxiety is going to be focused more specifically on particular situations versus being kind of this overarching thing. A dependent personality is someone who has a pervasive need to be taken care of, leading to submissive and clinging behavior or fear of separation. We're looking for 5 or more symptoms, which include difficulty making decisions without advice, everyday decisions. So this person may have a tough time figuring out like what bus route to take or when to leave to get to class on time. They may need others to assume responsibility in major areas of their life, so assistance with banking or rental agreements, things like that. Difficulty expressing disagreement with others because ultimately they're dependent on others. They don't want to disagree and risk those relationships. They may have difficulty initiating projects alone due to self-confidence issues. They may go to excessive lengths to obtain nurturance from others. They may be uncomfortable or helpless when alone, may seek out relationships as a source of care or support, which is different than seeking out relationships because you actually have something in common. And they may be occupied with fears of being left alone or to otherwise fend for themselves. So real dependence, real persistent reliance on others for very kind of basic day-to-day things. Good example of this one from the media is Buster Bluth from Arrested Development. He is I don't even know how old that character is. He's like a 30 plus age man who lives with his mother, does really whatever she wants, competes in mother-son pageants with her just to make her happy. So he'll kind of remain in her good graces and he won't be left to fend for himself. And he really, in arguments with his siblings, always kind of falls back on what his mother would say or advise. And when he finally does end up moving out, it's dating his mom's arch nemesis, who has the same name, and she's jokingly referred to as Lucille too in the show. And he ends up in kind of a very similar type of arrangement with this woman. So he's a good example of someone who's highly dependent. And finally, we have obsessive compulsive personality disorder. This is someone who has a pervasive preoccupation with orderliness, perfection, and control at the expense of flexibility, openness, and efficiency. And we're looking for 4 or more symptoms. So these include preoccupation with details, rules, lists, showing perfectionism in a way that interferes with task completion. So there's a difference between being efficient and perfectionistic, and doing so to an extent that it's actually kind of problematic and getting in the way. And that's really what we're dealing with more in this scenario. Being excessively devoted to work and productivity, overly conscientious and inflexible about morals, ethics, etc. So these are the rules and we're going to follow them and be very rigid, and there's not a lot of wiggle room. An inability to discard worn out, worthless objects, so kind of almost like a hoarding type symptom. Really, that one always kind of got to me when I was learning about this. Like, that one doesn't make any sense. If this person's so focused on perfectionism, why would we be hanging on to old things? A lot of it comes from like, oh, I might need this, or this was useful, so I'm going to hang on to it. A reluctance to delegate tasks to others, a frugal spending style, and just kind of a tendency to be really rigid and stubborn. There are a ton of media examples of this one. I always go for Monica from Friends. Very perfectionistic, hard worker, likes things her way, frugal, rigid. She also highlights that inability to discard worn out or worthless objects. She's got that kind of junk closet that's revealed in one season where, she's got this perfectly maintained apartment, and then she's got this random closet where she just kind of throws old things that she may need, and she won't let her husband put his stuff in that closet because his mess might ruin her mess. So great example of this particular type. So dependent personality disorder is someone who's very submissive, clingy, fears separation, avoidant, hypersensitivity to feedback from others. As I mentioned earlier, very similar to social anxiety disorder. There are a few distinctions. As I mentioned, there's that last symptom, that reluctance to take risks or try new things. Other differences include the chronicity or pervasiveness of the symptoms, the severity of the symptoms. Social anxiety disorder, also for that reason, also ends up being more treatable than avoidant. And then finally, obsessive compulsive personality, or OCPD, is that hyper focus on orderliness and perfection. And actually, in the same way that people frequently refer to quickly changing things as being bipolar, when really that's a better characterization of a borderline personality. People will frequently mix up OCD with OCPD, describing a roommate who is very clean and orderly as OCD, when in reality that person is probably closer to OCPD. So that tendency to be very clean, very organized, very conscientiousness, almost to a fault, that's really more OCPD, versus OCD is really that tendency to have those specific defined obsessions, most commonly paired with obsessions or paired with compulsions as well. So those are some differences between those two diagnoses. I gave you media examples. I would encourage you, as a study tip, or study technique to maybe come up with some others, because like I said, there are a ton of examples out there, and students in the past have said this has been a helpful way to learn these 10 distinct disorders. So if you so choose, completely up to you, this might be a fun activity and a helpful way to help you study, is to maybe come up with your own media examples. I eventually gave you examples for all 10 just because of the circumstances, but there are plenty out there. So suggested study technique if you are interested. I also want to introduce you guys to other personality models. Because really what we've talked about is obviously disordered personality, stuff that is contributing to a diagnosis at the end of the day. But that's not really the way that most people think of personality. When most people think of personality, they're thinking of traits. And there are other models that break down traits that aren't quite as focused on diagnosis. You may actually recall some discussion of this back in chapter 3 when I talked about assessment and how personality assessment can be focused on either clinical traits or non-clinical traits. So clinical traits, you guys know at this point, would be assessing for the presence of traits that relate to the 10 disorders we just talked about. Non-clinical personality, though, would be assessing for just any old personality trait that may be associated with clinical functioning, may not be. And the most well-known, most popular, most empirically backed, I would say, model of personality is definitely going to be the Big Five or 5-factor model of personality. How these 5 traits came about, or 5 factors, was through a ton of research, asking people to kind of indicate on surveys how they would describe themselves. And eventually researchers realized that these thousands of traits they were studying clustered or grouped into 5 big ones, which are conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness to experience, and extroversion. Conscientiousness is a tendency to be hardworking, dependable, self-disciplined. Agreeableness is a tendency to be good-natured, empathetic, caring. Neuroticism is kind of a negative combination of traits, tendency to be anxious, hostile, or depressed. Openness to experience describes imaginative, creative, curious folks, and extroversion describes more outgoing, talkative, sociable types of folks. And these aren't really types where you're one and not another. Rather, these are all thought of as dimensions, and people are really high or low on each of them. And I'm really just kind of showing you this slide just to kind of introduce you to another model, to another way to approach personality. So you guys should be familiar with the bare bones of this model for the exam as well. Finally, we've got causes and treatment. Genetically, the same causes for the disorders are the same causes for healthy, regular personality. About 50% comes from the environment, 50% from your parents, biological parents. Really what makes a disorder is what we talked about in the first slide. We're dealing with impairing traits that are rigid, that aren't flexible, that are causing distress or impairment to the individual or to others, aren't conforming with societal norms in our culture. So that's really what differentiates the disorder from regular personality, but it all kind of comes from the same place. Neuroimaging studies have revealed that the hippocampus and the amygdala are smaller in folks with borderline personality, which makes sense. Those are areas of the brain responsible for memory, emotion. So makes sense that those areas might be smaller in someone who is having really quickly changing emotions, might not really have the best memory for interpersonal interactions. And neuroimaging studies are also indicating that folks with antisocial personality may have a higher fear threshold or be chronically under-aroused, resulting in them needing to do more and more and more to just have any type of sensation neurologically. treatment's very difficult because at the end of the day, again, what we're dealing with is personality. There are only really a couple of things that distinguish disordered personalities from non-disordered ones. And so treatment would be just as difficult as me trying to make all of the introverts in the class extroverts and vice versa. It's just kind of the way you are. So it's very difficult to alter personality traits and treat in that way. The only empirically supported treatment is, as I mentioned before, dialectical behavior therapy for borderline personality, which is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy focusing on rapidly fluctuating symptoms and skills training. And so you can even kind of apply this approach to some of the other disorders where you're not really focused as much on changing personality, but on skills training and teaching a person to identify their problematic tendencies and choose to engage in healthier skills. Again, I'm not going to do any demonstrations this semester, but DBT is really kind of very skills-based, much like CBT is. It includes mindfulness, very similar to acceptance and commitment therapy, and really just entails kind of teaching skills, like teaching people to do the opposite of what their emotional state or their personality is urging them to do. And that is all that I have for you guys. All right, let me know if you have any questions. That's it.